the diagnosis and the prescription of what's being prescribed, especially by Mr. Malema around nationalisation, will actually set South Africa back 30 years and result in a significant withdrawal and decline in South Africa's economy over an extended period. Zambia had it for 30 years, Tanzania had it for 30 years, Ghana had it for 30 years. Why do we have to repeat exactly the same mistakes that these countries went through? So I'd just like to emphasize the point here. It's expropriation without comprehension. The impact that this will have on South Africa would be devastating. And but unfortunately, this perception, when you go and chat to a youngster who's unemployed, and just let's face the reality that 51% of youngsters between the age of 18 and 25 cannot find formal sector employment. When you go and chat to a youngster and say, well, if we nationalize the mining industry, we'll give you a job, of course they like the idea. The practical reality is that it will not solve the problem. The diagnosis might be right, but the problem solving, the prescription around nationalisation is wrong. South Africa is still very much perceived to be a mining investment destination by global fund managers. If I look at the contribution to tax receipts, last year about 17 billion direct corporate taxes were paid, which is between 15 and 20% of total corporate taxes received by government. I'll get into the expenditures in a moment. A lot spent on wages, a lot spent domestically, but I'll get into that in a second. Half of Transnet's business is mining. 94% of our electricity is generated by coal-fired power stations, etc., without going too much into all the detail. Now, folks, one thing that's been fascinating about the discussion in the nationalisation discussion has been this perspective that all the benefits of mining are shipped offshore. Now, what's interesting about it is that we've done some work using numbers generated by Stats South Africa. In 2010, the total expenditure of the mining sector was 441 billion. 228 billion of that was spent on the procurement of goods and services. That's transport, electricity, water, explosives, timber, overalls, you name it. It's basically the whole gambit of kind of like operating expenses. About 78 billion was spent on wages, most of that captured locally. About 50 billion on capital expenditure. That's a little bit lower than it has been normally. It's normally up at the sort of 60, 70 billion level, but that's because companies are still recovering from the global crisis and also because of other little policy challenges, or let's call it debate challenges that we have out there. 17 billion tax, 16 billion to shareholders, the people that enabled the investments to take place in the industry at the beginning. About 38 billion in impairments and depreciation charges, and about 13 billion in interest to banks. Now what we did is we then looked at the numbers and said, well, how much of that money is actually spent in South Africa? And we reckoned that about 5 to 10% of the total the 228 billion of operating expenses of the procurement of goods and services was procured locally. Places like Ekurhuleni are basically mining supplier parks. Only about 5% of that total is procured offshore because some of the products are not necessarily made in South Africa. If we look at salaries and wages, it's all local or regional. If we look at capital expenditure, we estimated that about 20% of that number was on imported capital equipment that is brought in to improve the total fixed capital stock of the sector. So again, adds to the productivity base of the sector. On the 16 billion of dividends, our view is about 60% of that goes offshore, 40% is captured locally by millions of South Africans through their pension fund shareholdings. Depreciation and impairments is basically a locally recognized charge, and on the interest to the banks, we reckon about 30% is probably offshore. So roughly 410 billion of the expenditure is captured locally. That's about 92% of the total value of the expenditures of South Africa's mining sector are located in South Africa. Why would you think that nationalizing the sector is going to give you any more benefit? The benefit is already captured in South Africa, folks.